Welcome. This video serves as a resource for anyone who may work with a Roberts Wesleyan teacher candidate. Whether you're full-time or adjunct faculty or a clinical educator, which are our OPE or student teacher host teachers, this video will help us all have common expectations around lesson planning. This is the template we use for lesson planning here at Roberts Wesleyan. It's formatted in this manner to help our students through the EdTPA process. We're finding that as we introduce this template early on in a student's program and then use it consistently throughout the program, which really is the key here, those students are well prepared for the rigors of EdTPA. Always be sure you're working with the most current version of the template. What you're looking at is the most current version right now. It was updated as of January 2017, which you can see up in the title. So let's take a look at each section to see what type of information should be included and how it should be formatted. Up here at the top is the preliminary information. Whether students are planning for an actual classroom of students or they're just planning for a classroom assignment, we still want them to think about all of these factors as they drive a lesson plan. So they need to put things in like the grade level, the number of students, how long the lesson might take. Here where there are options to choose, we like students to either type something after the choices here or just delete all of this and put where in the unit it occurs and what the structures for grouping are. This part is a little tricky when a lesson plan is being done for an assignment, but here we want the students thinking about what is the context in which they'll be teaching, what kinds of diversity might there be. So we like to tell our students, just kind of imagine a potential classroom in front of you, what might some of those factors be? So that way it kind of guides their lesson planning decisions. So that's the easy part. Then moving into this first part, this is goals for student learning. So here we like students to put what the big idea or concept is or the central focus for their lesson. This doesn't have to be lengthy by any means. But down here in the rationale or context for learning, this is really where students need to justify their plans. So they might talk about how this lesson links to prior learning, why it's needed for subsequent learning, why the choices that are going to be made are being made, things like that. So just more of a full description of what that central focus might be. This next section is pretty self-explanatory. To engage in this lesson, what's the prior knowledge students would need, prior skills that they would need, and prior academic language that they might need to participate in the lesson. Now here for the learning objectives, it's really important for students to really write a solid learning target. So first they need to write their teacher version, which is the objective. So they can phrase it, students will demonstrate or be able to, whatever makes the best sense to them. Make sure they get rid of these. They make it, rather than use the sentence stem, they actually write a complete sentence on their own. And then for the learning target, they have to start it with I can or I will. So again, making sure they get rid of the sentence stem and putting their complete learning target here. It just looks more professional that way rather than typing after what the sentence stem is. For the content standards, we do ask that they always, if they're teaching in a content area, that they do list their content standards and then their Common Core standards for literacy that would apply to their content area. Typically, we would want them to put the code, which would be like right here, RI 4.3, but then also put the standard as well. It helps them focus as they're planning so they can come back to look at the standard and see what is it that they're trying to accomplish. Now the academic language demands, this is a section that trips a lot of students up, but it's so important to really help them through EdTPA. There are descriptors up here for each of the different pieces, but sometimes students kind of struggle. Ultimately, language demands are the specific ways academic language is being used by students to participate in the lesson or to demonstrate their understanding. So it could be represented by the product. Typically it comes about from the learning target or the central focus. This is typically a sentence or two, more of like a narrative form. The language functions, that's literally the action verb from the learning target to represent either the reading, writing, speaking, listening, thinking, involved in the lesson. So this could just be one word or two. Again, the verb from the learning target. The vocabulary, this is easy, tier 2 and tier 3 words. They just need to list what were the main focus be for this lesson, what words they might teach to. And then discourse, these are the structures of written or oral language. So what are the kinds of things students will do in writing or orally? And then syntax, that's the set of conventions for organizing words, symbols, phrases into particular structures, such as like writing sentences, completing graphic organizers, developing a graph. I'll just show you a really quick example of one that's done well. Here you can see the language demands kind of describe in full what the tasks are for the lesson. The language functions just are phrases from the learning target. Here just a few tier 2 and tier 3, well actually no tier 3 for this lesson. Words are listed that are central to comprehending the text for this particular lesson. Discourse again is showing those structures for written or oral language. So there's turn and talk, sharing connections, and then syntax being those set of conventions for organizing thoughts, so writing a summary in this case. So that's just kind of to show you what that section should look like. So the second section is all about assessment. So in this first box, students have to figure out what or how they're assessing student learning. So they do need to think about how they're pre-assessing, and that could come from maybe some kind of formative assessment from a prior lesson, but they still need to describe what that is, what the assessment is, and what exactly they are assessing here. The formative assessment, or how learners are giving feedback, should be described in full here. As we know, every lesson needs to have a formative assessment, but again, not just describe the assessment, but what it is they're looking for. And then the summative assessment can be described here. If this is a standalone lesson, there may not necessarily be a summative assessment. It depends really on the topic or the purpose of the lesson. If that's the case, I like to tell students to think about learning as a bigger picture. So what would this lesson be leading up to? And then what would that summative assessment be at the end of that larger body of instruction? So once the assessments are determined, then students need to think about the standards and the criteria for assessing their students. So they need to think about what exactly will meet their expectation for this lesson, then what would exceed their expectations, and what would be below expectations. Students really need to think about including a lot of detail here so they know very clearly where a student would fall. This also needs to be directly aligned to the assessments listed above, which need to be directly aligned to the learning target they posted or they completed at the beginning of the lesson. Now the third part, this is the instructional sequence. And there are a couple of things to think about. Obviously, we want our students to really think about beginning, middle, end of a lesson, how they're going to hook their students, or what an anticipatory step might be. A pre-assessment might happen here. Within the middle of their lesson, we really want to see a solid use of gradual release of responsibility. And then in the closure, this is typically where a formative assessment might occur. I think these boxes sometimes are deceiving the students. They really need to include detail because they're novice teachers. And that doesn't necessarily mean they need to include a narrative in each of these sections. We don't really want to encourage students to read right from a lesson plan. It's very off-putting for the students in front of them. So it could be bulleted lists, or it could be more narrative in nature, but I think we still want to encourage students to think about how to make this a useful document. That being said, though, it can't be a bulleted list of very vague details. It needs to include step by step what the teacher moves are and then what the student responses that they're looking for should be. So we want a lot of detail in here to make this a meaningful piece of the lesson plan. We also are encouraging students to include pacing in each of these boxes. It's really difficult to anticipate pacing, especially if you're earlier on in your program, but we want students thinking about it right from the get-go so they can kind of practice how to fill a chunk of instructional time and try not to be underplanned, but also try to avoid being far too overplanned. So that can look a bunch of different ways. If we look at this example here, this student happened to put it at the end of each section, but sometimes other students will kind of put in parentheses after each portion of a lesson what they think or how much time they think they would be spending on each of those pieces. Then we move on to the differentiation or extension section. So students really need to think about what are the things they're going to do to reach both ends of the spectrum of students. So here we want to see students thinking about what they will do to support students with special needs. And that doesn't mean general statements like we'll follow the IEP, but things very specific, what strategies they'll use that will help to meet diverse needs within the context of their lesson above. So that should be directly related. They also need to think about how they can challenge above average students. So what things could they put into place for students who have already mastered the content? Not necessarily to do after the fact, but even to do within the body of the lesson if they happen to have those kinds of students. Here they describe what is it that they're doing in their classroom environment that supports student learning. So kind of what is the culture being established, what are the rituals and routines, what are the norms that are being used. Again, all related back to the lesson. And then extension could be next steps, like what will students be doing to extend the learning? It could be extending to another lesson, it could be extending to another piece or another time in the instructional day, it could even be homework. Finally, the what ifs. We really want our students to think proactively. So after they've completed their entire lesson plan, we like them to think about what if students, and then kind of substitute something in. What if something happens with participation, with not learning, with not mastering or reaching the learning target? So we do ask students to first plug in something, what if students, whatever it is that they put in there, they need to delete these dots, put in that what if, and then provide an answer to it. What would they do? And then what if students cannot? Again, plug in something that would happen there, and then what would they do to, again, kind of think proactively. So if and when those things do happen, they kind of have a plan B. So that's really it in a nutshell. Ultimately, when we have our students' lesson planning, we are thinking really about all of those things we know about quality lesson planning, thinking with the end in mind, and what we really drive home is alignment, making sure the learning target directly links to the assessment, which directly then impacts the kinds of instructional choices being made within the body of the lesson. And we also want to always see, well, as often as we can, that use of the gradual release of responsibility. If you have any questions about any of these, please feel free to reach out to any faculty member. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks.